Welcome to Farm Your Daily, a field forward podcast. I'm your host, David Geiger. Today on Farm Your Daily, it was a dry August. We'll take a look at that and other climate trends with State Climatologist Justin Glisan. Please be sure to like and follow the podcast as well as our social media at Field Forward Pod. We would love to have you join our community, keeping folks informed about what is affecting our farmers. This is Farm Here Daily. And joining me on Farm Here Daily, we're going to take a look at the weather once again. And to do so, we have our state climatologist Justin Glisan joining us. Dr. Justin Glisan here. Justin, thank you so much for your time. And let's take a look at the month of August. We got some catch-up time over that period, but we're now nearly 2 weeks into September. So let's first recap August. What's kind of the primary look at that month weather-wise?
Yep, so great to be with you, David, as always. After a second wettest July on record, we really flipped the script. Looking statewide, drier than normal across much of the state, about 3/4 of an inch below average. So if you look at 153 years of records, tying 1896 and 1904 as the 64th driest. So not exceedingly dry, but definitely drier than normal. And we did see some abnormal dryness creep back in on the drought monitor across southern Iowa.
So then with that dryness, did we see a return to some of the drier soil moisture levels? Did we see a return to some of the drought conditions in the state?
Yes. So with the lower dew points, we were actually on the temperature side right around normal. We did have some heat. We did have some cooler temperatures through August. But with those lower dew points, with the Gulf kind of shut off, not as much moisture making its way into the upper Midwest, that's where you start to develop an atmospheric thirst. So we did extract some of that shallow soil moisture. We've seen, especially in western and southern Iowa, deeper soil moisture being expended. Now, as the crop is maturing, our black layer in corn and soybeans are maturing as well. We're using less soil moisture, but with a lack of precipitation in August and a greater atmospheric demand, that's where we do see abnormally dry, that D0 category on the drought monitor reemerge in southern Iowa. So keeping an eye on the potential for rapid intensification of D0 and even the potential for moderate drought over the next few weeks if we stay dry and warm. We are seeing the warmer outlooks. However, if you look at the second and third week of September, we do see elevated chances of wetter conditions, which could help stave off intensification of dryness and drought.
Definitely would help our soybeans as well. They could use another quick drink before leaves start dropping on them. And as you look at those first couple of weeks of September, any trends to make note of before we head into the rest of the month?
Yep. So you look at the first 10 days, 11 days of September, we've been trending cooler than average. The first NASS reporting period of September, we were actually about 8 degrees below normal. So cooler temperatures statewide and across the upper Midwest, but also generally still drier than normal. If you look across the state, east to west, anywhere from 25% of normal for the first week and a half, 2 weeks of September. Only a little corner of southwestern Iowa along the Nebraska-Missouri border do we see above average rainfall. So you think about last September, one of the driest on record, also a warm September. We're trending on that drier side, at least for the first half of September, but the cooler temperatures have helped mitigate some of that stress that we would see given rainfall deficits.
I do want to take a look at the region as a whole because it's easy to get caught up in Iowa weather and Iowa drought monitoring. But to the south and to the east, they've had a pretty rough time when it comes to a lack of rainfall. And how is that, if it is, impacting our climate here in the Midwest?
Sure. So you think about July, we had a very robust moisture advection from the Gulf up into the upper Midwest. And this was a reflection on a very active severe weather season for the southern states. Soil profiles were not saturated, but had enough moisture in that as the air mass moves off of the Gulf across the southern states, that moisture is not extracted, so it's able to get into the upper Midwest, and that's why we saw a lot of rainfall in July. You look at the drought monitor as of this morning, across the eastern Corn Belt is where we see drought intensification and expansion. You see D1 from Ohio basically to Illinois, southern Illinois into Missouri. Lack of drought across the Gulf states, again, because of a very wet, severe weather season that we've seen. You look across the western part of the United States, that's where we see the most intense drought, west of the Continental Divide. So generally, this time of year, monsoonal moisture would make its way into the desert Southwest, and that's where they get a lot of the rainfall that they're seeing. Well, that mechanism is basically shut off right now, so they're not getting a lot of moisture in the desert Southwest, not a lot of moisture advection from the Gulf into the upper Midwest right now. So with the stable blocking high pressure system that's setting in across the Midwest, that's where we're going to see an increase in temperatures over the next 7 days, but also a lower potential for rainfall. But I did mention in those short-term outlooks getting into the second and third week of September, we do see a much wider spread probability of rainfall, whether it's thunderstorm driven or whether it's more low pressure driven, the synoptic scale rainfall. That's to be seen in the next forecast in the next 7 days. But the theme over the last few weeks has been dryness across much of the ag belt, particularly eastern ag belt.
All right, Justin, I want to just go back to some of the basics and kind of relearn, maybe revisit even something we may have learned in school at some point. I don't know what age bracket this would be, but you mentioned a low dew point. And that's another thing. I heard that earlier this week from Dr. Charles Herberg when I was talking about grain quality and grain storage as we look forward into the harvest season. And he was mentioning that it looks like we're going to have pretty low dew points. So, can we revisit that topic and just briefly describe what does a low dew point mean and how does it happen?
So we have the air temperature, which is basically the temperature you feel. That's the forecasted temperature. And we have the dew point temperature, the temperature at which dew forms. And that generally gives us the ceiling or the basement in terms of overnight lows. So let's say the dew point overnight will be 65. We generally don't get below that dew point because once we hit the dew point, dew forms and you get into energy released into the atmosphere. So lower dew points, and then you compare that to the air temperature, will give us relative humidity. So the lower the dew point, the lower the relative humidity, the drier the air out there. So you think of grain quality, you think of dry down in the field. The lower the dew point, the less moisture in the air, the more atmospheric demand there is for moisture. So that's where you get good dry down in the field. Now, if you had those high dew points like we had in the third week of July, when they're in the upper 70s and low 80s, that's extremely saturated air, very moist air. And if you're doing field work, if you're outside doing physical like exercise or anything that gets the heart rate going and sweating, that sweat's not going to evaporate because the dew point is so high. The air is just so saturated, there's nowhere for that moisture to go. So what we've seen recently of drier air, and we talked about this earlier, drier air, lack of precipitation, more atmospheric demand, that's where you're taking out moisture, any source that you can get, whether it's shallow soil moisture profiles, or if you get a rainfall event, it evaporates pretty fast because of how dry the air is. So that's basically what the dew point temperature is.
I appreciate that because sometimes we just get so used to just hearing topics and we have a general feel of how it is. And just once again, I know this is a bit of a tangent, but going into that, you have the general concept that water becomes a gas at a point of generally high temperatures. And so as the temperature goes lower, it would make sense to assume that it would then return to a liquid. And so when you're talking about the dew point here, that level of where it returns to being a liquid varies similarly because it also depends on how much of it is in the air. So when you have more water in the air, it's bouncing off of more particles. It requires a higher temperature to return to that liquid form. Whereas if you don't have as much water bouncing around in the air, then it can go all the way down to, as you were mentioning, the 60s, and that's when it would return to a liquid. And is that the general concept?
Yep. So going from liquid to gas, going from gas to liquid, there's energy transfer, there's energy released, energy absorbed. So another, maybe an easier way to think about this is drier soils in the winter. When you have drier soil profiles, you don't have that thermodynamic barrier to prevent frigid air, getting deeper down in the soil profile. So drier soils will freeze faster and they'll freeze deeper versus wetter soils because of that energy transfer. So yeah, it's a complex topic to talk about in meteorology, water balance, but it has a very important role in agriculture and in weather in general. So a warmer atmosphere will hold more water vapor. So we talk about these higher intensity events that we've seen more often. It takes more water vapor loading in a warmer atmosphere to produce an event, and that's where we see higher intensity rainfall events like we saw in July. So it's part of the climate system, but yeah, it's simple on its face when you're looking at the forecast, but it's a lot more complexity when you dig down into relative humidity versus absolute humidity and the amount of water vapor that a temperature profile can hold.
Thanks, Justin, for indulging in a little bit of a scientific tangent. I think it is important to recall that level of education that we probably got. Do you know when that's taught in schools, the general dew point, some of those aspects of science? Is that like an elementary school level education?
I think you get, fifth grade and in middle
Mm-hmm.
school is where you really
Right.
start to talk about the basics of the atmosphere. And
Right.
then you've got some curriculum out there in larger school districts that actually teach meteorology or the physical sciences. So you get chemistry talking about water vapor or talking about different gases. Um, yeah. So when I give presentations on our climate system, I show pictures of Jupiter and Saturn. They're big fluid gas giants. They behave differently than a inert atmosphere over a rock, which is Earth. So it's fascinating to talk about, and people love to talk about, the weather system and all the components that go into it.
That is a super cool topic. I don't know if I'll be able to dive into that, but I didn't even consider studying meteorology on other planets. That is amazing. That's really cool. And I guess there is a reason why they had that show. Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader? Sometimes it's for some of us. It's been a while since fifth grade. So once again, good to revisit. Good to relearn some things that you might just have assumptions now on. So I appreciate that. This is Farm Your Daily. We will continue the conversation in just a moment, but first, a look at the marketplace. And there was green at the close on Thursday. December corn, 2 3/4 cents higher, 4.19 3/4. March, 2 3/4 more as well, 4.37 1/4. Soybeans in November, 8 1/4 higher, 10.33 1/2, with January rising 7 3/4 at 10.52 1/2. Soybean meal in October, $2.60 a ton in the green, $286.10. Soybean oil in October, 3/5 of a penny higher, 51.08 a pound. December wheat, 6.5 cents up, 5.21 1/2. March rising 5 3/4, 5.38 1/4. December hard red winter wheat, 3 cents more at 5.10, with March 2 3/4 up at 5.30 1/4. In livestock market close for Thursday, green there as well. October live cattle up $1.12, 232.27 a hundredweight. December rising $1.45 at 234.12. Feeder cattle in September, $2.02 a hundredweight more at $355.22, with October an increase of $1.95 at $352.35. Lean hogs in October, $1.35 a hundredweight up at $98.17, with December rising 97 cents at $89.25 a hundredweight. That is the Thursday market close. This is Farm Your Daily. Dr. Justin, let's take a look now at the future. We have 3 more weeks left of September. Folks are going to be starting to get into the fields very soon. What are some of the expectations? You mentioned it looks like it could get a little wetter this September, but what is the more long-term meteorological forecast?
Yep. So we have various flavors of our outlooks. We have our 6 to 10, 8 to 14-day outlooks that are issued every day around 2:30. And then we have the 3 to 4 week outlook that is issued every Friday. And that bridges the gap from the short-term outlooks to the monthly outlooks. So if you look at those short-term outlooks for much of the Midwest, we are seeing through the 2nd to 3rd week of September higher probabilities of warmer temperatures, but also a return to a more active storm track, better chances of rainfall. You look at that 3 to 4 week outlook, which is basically 3rd week of September into early October. For central and eastern Corn Belt locations, higher probabilities of warmer temperatures. And then if you look at the Great Lakes to the Ohio Valley, basically from Wisconsin, Ohio down into Missouri, Illinois, Kentucky, and Tennessee, including much of Iowa and Minnesota, higher probabilities of drier conditions. So if you think of the law of averages, if our short-term outlooks in the 6 to 10, 8 to 14 day are showing wetter chances, it's looking like the end of the month getting into October could be drier than average for much of the Corn Belt. We also see a higher probability of La Nina conditions developing in fall, and we've talked about these teleconnections in previous episodes. These could have implications on temperature and precipitation. However, there's a much lower correlation as we enter the fall versus a La Nina or El Nino existing in wintertime, given large scale versus small scale. However, if you look at years which we do have La Nina conditions in fall, going back to 2000, we generally see warmer and drier conditions. And that's kind of what we're seeing in the outlooks in the 3 to 4 week and also the seasonal outlooks for meteorological fall, September, October, November.
As you look at some of those outlooks, then let's visit the telekinetic pattern of the globe. We are about 70% of the way through the year. Do we have some ideas of what is to come pattern wise over the next year?
Yeah, so it's a great question. We always look at, and so the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which is a dominant climate driver in the Pacific. We also have other oscillations that are important. And when I say oscillation, we think of large scale climate patterns that are semi permanent. We have the Madden-Julian oscillation. We have other patterns that become more prominent in wintertime, such as the Arctic oscillation, which we can basically predict 2 to 3 weeks out. And it gives us a very good indicator on cold air outbreaks. So looking at the potential for a weak La Nina moving into winter, if we look at analog years in which we do see this behavior, we generally see a little more snowfall across the upper Midwest, anywhere from 4 to 8 inches above average. Now, the previous La Nina winters that we've had a triple dip La Nina 2020 through 2022. We actually saw less snowfall in parts of the state, more in other sections of the state. Iowa just happens to be right in the middle of the interface when you look at La Nina or El Nino events. So the climate system is complex. These teleconnections can amplify or de-amplify each other, and that's why I love my job. It makes it very interesting. You really dig down into the modeling, into what we've seen in previous years to kind of give us better guidance, particularly for our farmers and producers for the next season, because it gives them an idea of what hybridization to potentially plant. Are we going to see wetter conditions? Are the drier conditions that we've seen recently going to persist? So that's why the climate sciences, atmospheric sciences, and our climate services are so important across agriculture and just for the general public, and because everybody likes to talk about the weather.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Want to definitely make sure we're continuing to support our meteorological services across the country and across the state. I would just ask, you mentioned since we're in that kind of center portion where we can be affected one way or the other, and it's not always certain, does that also add for extreme shifts? Because I remember the last La Nina was we had basically no snow, and then suddenly we got 2 feet just out of nowhere, and then there was no snow after that either. Is that a possibility?
It could be a blip, but if you look trend-wise for wintertime, it's the fastest warming season for most of the upper Midwest. With a faster warming winter, we've seen historically over the last 15 to 20 years less snowfall, a transition to more rain and mixed precipitation events. You also think back to December 15th, 2021, serial derecho, 63 tornadoes across the state of Iowa. We're also seeing more severe weather events push into wintertime. So overall, winter is an extreme season. We've seen cold air outbreaks with the polar vortex destabilizing. We've also seen very warm temperatures. So yes, the jet stream becomes more variable in wintertime, it becomes stronger, and you see more persistent behavior locking in. So yes, the extremes you're talking about, you can have, think of the Caucasus. We had very frigid temperatures, and that was the only snowfall that we saw for that winter season, 10 to 20 inches across the state. That has implications on the next growing season, a lack of snowfall, a deeper frost depth. If you do get rainfall early in the springtime and the frost depth is still deep, you're not infiltrating that moisture, it's running off. So you're not supplying or resupplying soil moisture to the profile, and this has implications on the growing season in general. So that's why our meteorologists and climatologists are so important, because we study these trends and then make sure we're getting the proper information out to those that need it. And these types of communications, these interviews that we do often are remarkable in that we're able to get that information out. And you asking these great questions really supplies that information, and it kind of pushes back on some of the bad information that we see on social media sometimes.
We absolutely see lots of bad information. And I think the very cool thing about following and speaking regularly with climatologists and meteorologists is that it also shows how important it is to have someone on this constantly, because the information as we get it can change pretty quickly, and it could be a shift in some of the telekinetic patterns that we talk about, or it could just be simply some moisture level changes or atmospheric pressure changes, and suddenly what was expected is no longer happening. And so the nuance and the in-depth changes in analysis needs to be continued upon in order to properly reach our communication goals and also our assessments of what's going on weather-wise.
That I couldn't summarize it better.
Justin Glisan is our state climatologist here in Iowa. Thank you so much, Justin, for joining us on Farm Here Daily.
Thanks, David.
This is Farm Here Daily, a field forward podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Again, in order to continue to produce this type of local content, we would love to have you join our community, so please follow the podcast as well as our social media channels at Field Forward Pod. You can also find me on social media at Geiger Reports. Again, I am your host, David Geiger, and I'll be back again tomorrow, everybody.